For decades, the US has sent Israel billions of dollars in aid, blocked UN resolutions in their favor, and backed up the Jewish state militarily. Conspiracy theorists have claimed that America works for Israel, blaming all of the United States' problems on the Jewish state.
Benjamin Netanyahu on camera right after said this is a good thing because it brings the United States into a conflict that we've been involved in on an existential level for decades.
From 9/11 to the invasion of Iraq to America's lack of socialized healthcare. These accusations aren't just coming from YouTube trolls in tinfoil hats. Thinkers, writers, activists, even politicians have begun to question whether this special relationship still serves US interests. As Israel grows increasingly isolated on the world stage, Americans are wondering, why does the United States still support Israel? The special relationship between Israel and the US wasn't always so special. In fact, for decades, it wasn't much of a relationship at all. After World War I, the Brits took control of the territory between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. But as Jews and Arabs duked it out for control of the territory, the Brits realized they were in over their heads. In 1947, they handed the problem over to the UN, which held a vote on whether to partition Palestine into two states, one for Jews, one for Arabs. Along with 32 other countries, the United States voted to split the land, and the resolution passed. But the partition plan did not calm tensions between Jews and Arabs in Palestine. It inflamed it. As the Brits made arrangements to leave, Jews and Arabs prepared for a massive showdown. To make America's stance clear, President Harry Truman immediately placed the whole region under an arms embargo. He may have had a personal soft spot for the idea of a Jewish state, but the US State Department had no intention of letting feelings dictate American foreign policy. It simply did not serve American interests to support the unborn Jewish state in a fight it seemed destined to lose. Just weeks before the British left for good, the US warned the Jews of Palestine not to count on any American support. The State Department even reversed its stance on partition, certain the Jewish state would not survive the showdown everyone knew was coming. But there was another benefactor waiting in the wings. If the US wasn't going to step in and flex its muscle, then the USSR sure would. Yeah, remember those guys? Totalitarian communist empire? Pretty anti-Semitic? Well, until their demise in 1991, the Soviet Union loomed large in American foreign policy. Just like the Americans, the USSR were doing their best to lure as many countries as possible into their orbit, including the new Jewish state, which just so happened to be led by socialists. Poor, desperate, massively outgunned socialists gearing up for the fight of their lives. That desperation gave the Soviets an opportunity to get their foot in the door. It was the USSR, not the Americans, who sold the Jews of Palestine the weapons they needed to confront 5 invading Arab armies. But the whirlwind romance between Israel and the USSR didn't last long. Israel was just a little too pro-Western for the Soviets' liking. The feeling was kind of mutual. The United States had no intention of lifting its arms embargo, but it did loan Israel roughly $120 million in economic aid each year, as the Jewish state buckled under the pressure of absorbing nearly 1 million refugees from the Arab world, many of them penniless. This aid was a drop in the bucket for the US, which was pouring billions into Europe's post-war reconstruction. To the Israelis, however, it was a lifeline. But all the economic aid in the world doesn't matter when you're not sure your country will survive the year. And that's exactly how Israelis felt when the USSR started wooing Egypt in 1955. Their most powerful rival was now equipped with $83 million worth of Soviet tanks, fighter planes, and bombers. Israelis were used to living under existential threat, but this was an escalation. And still, the US kept up its embargo. Not that the Israelis were sitting around waiting for someone to save them. Back in 1952, the first Israeli prime minister had established a nuclear program. A bold move for a country that couldn't even produce its own radios. But the state was small, poor, and deeply vulnerable. It needed every advantage it could get. And nothing says, "Don't mess with me," like a nuclear weapon. The gambit paid off. A decade later, the White House was so suspicious about Israel's nuclear program that JFK offered to lift the arms embargo if the Israelis agreed to let the US inspect their nuclear facilities. They did, though they were not entirely transparent with the American inspectors. And maybe JFK would have pushed the Israelis a little harder on what exactly they were doing in that nondescript complex in the middle of nowhere if he hadn't been assassinated just a couple of years later. Conspiracy theorists, don't get excited. The Mossad did not assassinate JFK. His successor kept up the inspections and the arms sales. A nuclear arms race in the Middle East wasn't ideal. But if Israel remained the sole nuclear power in the region, that served the American interests perfectly. The stronger the Jewish state became, the more useful it was to the United States, especially as the Cold War started heating up. But Washington had other, slightly more romantic reasons for supporting Israel. As the sole democracy in a neighborhood full of autocrats, Israel was considered an aligned country that shared both American values and American interests. During the Cold War, when communist countries were seen as a dangerous enemy, that counted for a lot. And so did public opinion. Americans across the political spectrum had a soft spot for the Jewish state, for a variety of reasons. Jewish Americans advocated on Israel's behalf, emphasizing its shared values with the United States. But many Americans didn't need to be told about shared values. They saw themselves in the story of this scrappy new state. Some were taken by the frontier spirit of the early Zionist pioneers, who had left everything behind to build up the Promised Land. To this day, a vein of chutzpah, of ruggedness, runs through the stories both countries like to tell about themselves. And though Israel was an explicitly Jewish country without a legally enshrined separation of synagogue and state, many Americans appreciated the Judeo-Christian values both countries shared, an obvious contrast to the communist countries that seemed so threatening during the Cold War. American Christians, meanwhile, supported the Jews' return to their ancestral homeland as the fulfillment of biblical prophecies. But you didn't need to be a Christian to find deep meaning, even divine justice, in the story of the Jews' return to Israel. And when that story got the Hollywood treatment in 1960, Americans became enchanted with this tiny nation of survivors. Especially after the Israelis captured Eichmann, the architect of the final solution, and broadcast his trial to the world. Many Americans were already familiar with the scale of the Holocaust, the newsreel footage of emaciated survivors. But the human brain isn't designed to comprehend numbers like 6 million. It's designed to understand stories. That's what the trial broadcast to the world, the intimate, personal testimonies of ordinary people who had somehow managed to claw their way out of hell. Justice was served not in some war-ravaged European court, but in the rebuilt ancestral homeland of the very people that Eichmann had tried to erase. Talk about a comeback story. To many Americans, the story of Israel seemed almost miraculous, a truth stranger and more satisfying than fiction. And Israel's stunning victory in the Six-Day War of 1967 confirmed it. Somehow, in a matter of decades, the Jewish people had gone from being slaughtered en masse to being powerful. Public support for Israel surged, and for the first time, Americans' sentimental and cultural attachment to Israel dovetailed with their geopolitical considerations. Because it was the USSR, America's biggest enemy, that had supplied the Arab states with billions of dollars in military aid. In under a week, Israel turned that investment into a pile of scrap metal and ash, humiliating the Soviets so badly that they suspended all diplomatic relations with the Jewish state, and making the Americans sit up and take notice. Suddenly, Israel was no longer the runt of the litter, a cute little underdog to root for without committing too much, but a formidable military power and useful asset in the region. Americans had always liked Israel. Now, they realized Israel might actually have something to offer, other than a satisfying story. But it would take another few years for Israel to demonstrate its true value as a US ally, ironically, during the Jewish state's darkest moment. Just a few years after the Six-Day War, Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Yom Kippur, the holiest day on the Jewish calendar, catching the Israelis completely unaware. For a few terrible days, it seemed the end was near for the Jewish state. The Israeli defense minister was so rattled, he started muttering about the fall of the Third Temple, code for, "Hey guys, I think we're screwed," which made him a real hit at government meetings. The Israelis flooded the US Secretary of State with desperate pleas for aid, but Kissinger wasn't so sure helping Israel was a good idea. Things had been looking up between the US and the USSR. The two superpowers hadn't exactly ended their arms race, but they had agreed to slow it down, establishing a period of détente, which is a fancy way of saying, okay, we'll stop going for each other's throats. But Egypt and Syria's surprise attack on Israel threatened to blow up this fragile détente, big time. Because Moscow was backing the Arab countries, but if the US helped Israel, they risked really ticking off the USSR, not to mention the oil-rich Arab states. And no one wanted the world's two major nuclear superpowers ticked off. But then, the USSR did something really, really dangerous, and really, really stupid. They placed their own jets on high alert, a signal that they were considering putting Soviet jets in the skies above Israel, all while claiming they wanted a ceasefire. Well, the US administration was not about to let the Soviets get away with this kind of escalation. Israel and the US found themselves completely on the same page. The Soviets and their proxies could not be allowed to win a war in the Middle East. So Congress passed an emergency $2.2 billion aid package and sent Israel its first major arms shipment, beginning the special relationship we know today. But that relationship came with a price. The oil-rich Arab states were furious that the US had armed Israel, so they embargoed all oil shipments to any country that supported the Jewish state. Suddenly, the price of oil quadrupled. Gas became both scarce and ridiculously expensive, and the United States was forced to confront its own dependency on imported oil, an issue that continues to challenge developed nations around the world. This was not the first time that some American citizens questioned their government's support for Israel, and it certainly would not be the last. But the United States refused to be bullied, even as gas prices rose. And most Americans blamed the Arab states and the oil companies, not the Israelis. After all, Israel had been attacked first, by nations backed by the USSR, America's sworn enemy. For many Americans, Israel and the US were fighting the same fight. And that is why the US began sending Israel billions of dollars in military aid, which Israel then used to buy American defense equipment. And that trend has continued, even after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. Because it turned out that the USSR wasn't the only threat to American interests in the Middle East. When Al-Qaeda attacked the United States on 9/11, Washington realized there were few countries as familiar with terror or better equipped to confront it than Israel. 9/11 coincided with the Second Intifada, the hellish 5-year stretch during which Israeli buses exploded with alarming regularity. Throughout that time, Israelis felt isolated, traumatized, afraid, and deeply sympathetic to the Americans whose entire world had just been brutally rearranged. It was a grim solidarity, but it further cemented the bond between the two countries. Of course, alliances needed to provide more than just vibes, and the Israelis delivered. The Israeli intelligence services had shared information with the CIA since the Cold War, but after 9/11, the two countries cooperated more closely than ever. Israel had eyes and ears everywhere, and they were willing to share what they knew, saving the US both the cost and risk of deploying assets in dangerous places. But Israeli intelligence wasn't limited to espionage. Israel is a leader in defensive technology, and its Iron Dome and David Sling systems were developed in collaboration with the US, advancing both American and Israeli defense capabilities. Israel doesn't buy billions of dollars worth of American weapons each year for funsies. Unfortunately, they have to use those systems regularly, acquiring vast amounts of data in the process. That data goes right back to the US, helping American engineers refine American defense systems. And the same is true for the Israeli tech that the US uses. Israeli defense systems and strategies are tested on the battlefield before they make their way to US troops. Israeli expertise in urban combat, medical triage, and even vehicle protection have saved American lives in combat zones like Iraq and Afghanistan. But warfare is evolving, and the modern battlefield is no longer just a physical place. The fighting happens in bits and bytes, in the invisible ether of cyberspace. And there too, Israel and America rely on each other's research and innovations, positioning both nations as leaders in global military technology. It's quite an evolution for a country that was once the neighborhood runt, but a dominant regional power has far more responsibilities than the local isolated underdog. And Israel's status as a military and technological powerhouse and America's closest ally in the region has raised questions about the way it wields that power. These questions aren't new. Popular support for Israel dips whenever Americans feel that the Jewish state is abusing its power. In 1982, the IDF entered Lebanon to root out the PLO, which was using South Lebanon as a base of operations. But the invasion quickly spiraled out of control. And when a Lebanese militia allied with the IDF slaughtered upwards of 1,000 Palestinian refugees, Americans blamed Israel. And so did Israelis. Hundreds of thousands of Israeli citizens took to the streets in protest. That trend has continued through every major Israeli operation. And for their part, many Israelis also aren't sure how to feel about their special relationship to the United States. Israel may be a regional power, but it's got nothing on the most powerful country in the world. And that power imbalance doesn't always work in Israel's favor. American support comes with strings, and many Israelis think that it's time to break free of those strings, to maintain their alliance, but reduce their dependence on the United States, especially after 2 years in Gaza. The Israelis held off on major operations that might have ended the hostilities much sooner because of White House pushback. and Israelis are questioning whether it's time to bolster their own independence as Americans grow increasingly hostile to the Jewish state. Because after 2 years in Gaza, support for Israel is now at an all-time low among young Americans. It's not just a matter of optics, though of course, the images out of Gaza are heartbreaking and inescapable. Most of us have instant 24/7 access to graphic footage from combat zones around the world. Anyone with an internet connection can become a disaster tourist, ogling at the horrors in HD. And there is no shortage of horrors in Gaza. And no shortage of bad actors to exploit them. Mixed in with the real and devastating footage out of Gaza is a stream of AI slop, conspiracies, and misinformation. And this avalanche of misery, both real and fake, has deeply influenced young Americans' perspective on Israel. To their parents and grandparents, Israel was the scrappy underdog who repeatedly beat the odds, whether the threat came from the Egyptian army or a PLO hijacker. But today's young Americans only see a powerful military pulverizing a civilian enclave. More than a third of Americans under 30 believe Hamas's fight against Israel is valid, and nearly a third aren't sure how to feel about Hamas's actions on October 7th. For many Jews, this came as a nasty surprise, but others saw this coming. The culture has changed, and so have the underlying assumptions that were once a source of sympathy towards the Jewish state. Many Americans still point to parallels between their country and Israel, but those parallels have been rebranded as a source of shame. Nationalism is going out of style. The rugged frontier spirit that was once a source of American pride is now an embarrassing example of European settler colonialism. Under this new set of cultural norms, Jewish nationalism is taboo, and early Zionists were just as bad as the American settlers who pushed their way west. For some on the left, both the United States and Israel are illegitimate, their shared values deeply problematic, which makes Americans far more sympathetic to Palestinians than ever before. For a long time, Palestinians were largely invisible as an independent people with political aspirations. When the news did mention them, it was often in the context of those exploding buses. And 9/11 certainly didn't help the Palestinians' image among Americans, as anti-Arab and anti-Muslim sentiment festered and swelled. But after America's racial reckoning, many are determined to right their country's past wrongs of racism, white supremacy, and Islamophobia. But this admirable commitment has influenced the way they see Israel too. It is crude and inaccurate to superimpose American racial dynamics on Israel. But that hasn't stopped Americans from projecting their own racial baggage on Israelis and Palestinians. In this view, Israelis are white and powerful, using white supremacist tactics to oppress Palestinians, aka people of color. It's a reductive and inaccurate analysis, but many Americans have adopted it wholesale. And while it's important for Americans to revisit their history and apply a new and critical lens to their past, it's equally important not to impose that view on the rest of the world. Israelis and Americans may share basic values, but Israel is not a miniature America. Its history is distinct. It's more important than ever for Americans to understand that, because right now, 1/3 of young Americans either can't or won't recognize atrocities when they're carried out against Jewish people. And that is deeply worrying. Support for a Jewish state doesn't need to be a zero-sum proposition. Supporting Israel shouldn't mean hating Palestinians. And you can support Palestinians or be anti-war without calling for the dismantling of a country that is home to 10 million people. No one can predict the future of this special relationship between Israel and the United States. But for all its problems, Israel is a powerful, capable ally at the forefront of technological, military, medical, and scientific innovation. As the world gears up for new threats and new confrontations, those capabilities will be invaluable to any country that allies with the Jewish state.